Alright guys, so video for April 29, 2020. A lot of key concepts today because we're getting near the end of the unit. You also have your DBQ assessment this Thursday instead of Friday. So I'll be sending reminders via Google Classroom for you guys to remember to sign in. We're changing it so that it's more closely aligned to the AP exam. So it's going to be Thursday at 1, but I'll recap that at the very end after I go over all the information. So we'll start with the key concepts first. So the background for 5.6 is that as industrialization spread, nations were faced with clashes between modernization and conservative traditions. So they were kind of conflicted as far as, do they keep doing things the way they've done things for so long, or do they help their country by modernizing and taking on these new advancements in technology? Some places like Egypt, Japan, Russia, and the Ottoman Empire, the government actually encouraged and supported industrialization, and even helping some laws to help pass and facilitate that industrialization process. In other places like China, the governments were way too weak or corrupt at the time to be able to sponsor industrialization, so it took a lot longer in those states or in those areas. So let's talk about Ottoman industrialization first. The Ottoman Empire did not adopt Western Enlightenment ideas. There are going to be some reforms and there are going to be some changes, but immediate adoption of these new ideas doesn't happen overnight. So they moved away from the Enlightenment ideas and technology, which pretty much left them behind the rest of the Western world. Corruption is going to lead to decline, and it's going to lead also to the spread of nationalism. Because of the Ottoman Empire being so diverse, you can see a map right there. It pretty much covers parts of Europe, parts of Northern Africa, parts of what we would know as the Middle East, Turkey, a whole bunch of areas. It's made up of a bunch of diverse groups of people, and therefore trying to create a nationalistic idea under the Ottoman Empire is going to be very difficult, because not all of these groups share the same culture, ethnicity, language, religion, and whatnot. So it is going to have a lot of corruption and a lot of conflict. As a result, the Ottoman Empire is going to become known as what's called the sick man of Europe. So it's basically going to be kind of like a cancer that is feeding off of the rest of the world. And the Russians are noticing that this is happening and the Ottoman Empire is slowly falling apart. So the Russians are going to be very eager to kind of expand and take over parts of the Ottoman territory that is left weak. For example, it doesn't have anything to do with Russia. It has to do with a different group, but it's a part, or it shows you how the Ottoman Empire starts splitting and starts dividing itself into factions. So you have Muhammad Ali, not the boxer. Muhammad Ali, the picture up there, he was in Egypt. At the time, Egypt was still part of the Ottoman control, but it functioned mostly independently. So Egypt is in Africa. It is separated geographically from the rest of the Ottoman Empire. And so a lot of the reasons why Egypt operated independently is because of the distance. Ali is actually going to take control of Egypt and make a lot of changes without the Sultan's permission. However, these changes are going to kind of just work for Egypt, so the Sultan isn't going to get involved. Some of these reforms that Ali included or did, he westernized the military, he created an official newspaper, he taxed the peasants. That mostly had to do with the fact that he also helped or controlled the cotton production in Egypt. He secularized religious lands. That's really important. When something is secularized, it basically means that it's removed from the hands of the church. So in this case, religious leaders would have control of major pieces of property. He takes away control from those religious leaders and then gives the land back to the people, which allows them to provide for themselves. And then he also allows for industrialization, the building of factories and buildings of ships to be able to create a navy for the Ottoman Empire, because the Ottomans did not have a full working navy at that point. Then you have Japanese industrialization. After centuries of isolation, about almost 300 years, Japan actively sought Western technologies and innovations to help it become equal to Western nations. I did talk about this briefly yesterday. It's a defense mechanism. During the Meiji Restoration, Japan was actually able to become a modern industrialized nation in less than half a century, and that is really quickly, not just for an Asian country, but for any country. And a lot of it had to do with the fact that it was state-sponsored industrialization. The government was 100% backing this. Part of the problem is that Japan realized they were going to have issues with foreigners. So as in countries like Great Britain, the Netherlands, and Russia, they industrialized and they wanted to sell their goods in Japan. On top of that, they also wanted to add Japan as a stopping point on their way to China so that they could stop and refuel. So one instance where you actually have conflict is in 1863. You have the Commodore Matthew Perry, and I think that's funny because it's like the name of the Friends actor, but they're not the same guy. That's Matthew Perry. He demanded Japanese people open trade with the United States. So he actually was a Commodore for the United States Navy. Japan eventually relented, which means they kind of realized they were going to face a losing battle. So they created this version of defensive industrialization after China was humiliated by the West. When China refused to open its doors to foreigners and they have a series of rebellions, China is eventually going to lose all of its major ports, and European powers are going to go in there and carve China up with a little knife. And I showed you guys a political cartoon of that actually happening. The Qing Emperor is trying to stop everybody, and you can see them like cutting up China like pieces of a pie. So they did not want that same situation to happen in Japan, and so Japan realized that they needed to have this push towards industrialization. So they did adopt enough Western technology to protect their traditional culture. So they still tried to hold on to as much of the Japanese culture as much as they could. The reason that this is successful and the reason that they're able to industrialize is because they actually overthrew their shogun. So if you go back a little bit and remember when I talked about the social hierarchy of Japan, the shogun is the one that's actually in charge. Shoguns are like these very extremely wealthy, powerful families or warlords. They control the daimos, they control the samurais. Everybody works for them. Yes, there is an emperor, but the emperor is just the emperor in name. He doesn't have any actual power. However, there is a coup d'etat, or an overthrow, if you will, in 1803, in which the Mej family or the Mej Restoration takes place, and they are going to create an emperor that has complete control of the country, which is why, again, Japan is able to do this state-sponsored industrialization. So the Mej Restoration, you have Japanese officials who had visited the United States, they had visited Europe, they began to study and also implement reforms that they had saw, and they wanted to emulate those or copy those into the Japanese business model. So some of these things included abolishing feudalism, establishing a constitutional monarchy, so giving their people individual rights, establishing equality in law and fair punishment, reorganizing the army and making a navy, creating a new school system, building roads, building regular roads, subsidizing industrialization. That means kind of dividing up the process amongst different corporations, and adopting some ideas of Western imperialism. Imperialism is going to be a topic that we probably talk about next week, but it's when one country goes to another country and invades it because they're more powerful and they're trying to look for resources. So Japan is going to be one of these imperialistic countries as well. The results are going to be that Japan is grows economically extremely rapidly. So you saw it in less than half a century. They're able to industrialize, which is pretty impressive for any country, not just an Asian country. However, some of the problems that are going to pop up in Japan are the same problems that pop up in other industrialized countries. For example, in Europe and even in America, we're going to talk about women and children being exploited, pollution, damaging effects on the environment, and etc. So there are going to be things that also follow negatively with the industrialization of Japan. The state-sponsored industrialization, it played a major role. So in places like the Ottoman Empire in Qing China, the industrialization was resisted, so there was a big pushback. In other places like Russia and Japan, the government actually encouraged this and made it a push forward. Private investment in Japan was important, so there was state sponsorship, but there was also a lot of private money that was coming into the country. This private money is usually from foreign investors, and it's going to allow the foreign investors to invest their capital, invest their money, and then grow the economy. In Japan, businesses were sold to what's known as a saibatsu, which are powerful family businesses in Japan that would still kind of even maintain control even to this day. So let me just give you an example. In 1906, there was a company that was created. It was called the Toyota Loom Works Company. There's a picture of the loom right there. The loom is a machine that it allows people to make fabric, like thread, rapidly. Instead of doing it by hand or strand by strand at a time, it's a machine that does it and it mass produces cloth. Eventually, that is going to work its way or evolve into what will eventually become the Toyota Motor Company. So you're going to see these long-standing businesses have a long-lasting impact on the Japanese industrialization process. Okay, So 5.7, economic developments and innovation. So some changes. As global trade and communication increased, you have mercantilist policies being replaced by laissez-faire policies, which we talked about, that encouraged minimal government involvement and trade. A lot of that was based off of Adam Smith's ideas from the book that he wrote, The Wealth of Nations. He had a very strong push towards capitalism. Capitalism was the idea that a person or a business, I'm going to move myself because I'm covering the Monopoly board here. Whoops. A person can make money, or a business can make money, and that doesn't have to have any involvement from the government whatsoever. It's all private property, it's all privately owned, and that's occurring a lot more as we see a shift away from mercantilism. So you do have traditional forms of business ownership in which you have one, a single business owner, or two, a small group of people who make business decisions. The negatives of that were that single owners, if you were just the one person responsible for owning a business, you took a lot of risks, because if your business failed, you were 100% responsible for the losses economically. When you have something different like corporations, these are things that are businesses chartered by a government, or they're businesses that are owned by stockholders. And this works well for a lot of people because it's way less risky. In this type of government or in this type of corporation, you're only paid out when the corporation itself makes money. So some positives are that if the corporation loses money, stockholders are protected because the only money that they lose is the money that they invested personally. They don't lose 100% of the money, or they're not 100% responsible for the losses. They only lose the amount of money that they themselves put in. So it's a shared interest. It's called limited liability. Then you have companies that operate on a monopoly system. That's why I put the monopoly board there. A monopoly is basically when you have one extremely strong corporation that controls all of the industry. They eliminate competition. They own all the steel. They own all the oil. They own all the communications. There is no competitors for them whatsoever. Eventually, monopolies are going to become illegal, but at this point, they are not. So, for example, you have Krupp Steel in Germany, which I want to say is like a 400-year dynasty of this family owning a steel company in Germany. You have John D. Rockefeller in the United States, who would own Standard Oil. And if you are familiar with the name Rockefeller, his family is still rich even to this day. There's Rockefeller Center in New York. There's the Rockettes, who's a famous dance team that was, named after him. It's where they light the big, huge, Christmas tree in New York City. So these families are going to have long-lasting legacies or dynasties based on the amount of wealth they accumulated at that time, because it was just so great. Okay, so moving myself again. Here we go. You have also the effects of industrialization on business organization, so how businesses are organized. You're going to have the creation of what are called transnational companies, and this is because companies are now going to have to operate across national boundaries. You're going to have people who are working and living in the United States who own companies overseas, and vice versa. People who work and live in Europe who own companies in the United States. That's what it means by transnational. They have to go across nations. It's going to gain wealth for people and influence, popularity, social standing on a scale that has never been seen before. In Hong Kong and Shanghai, you're going to have the creation of a banking corporation. The British-owned bank actually opened the colony of Hong Kong in 1865. And originally, it was created to finance corporate investment, and banking was very central to that area. One of the very first international banks was located in Hong Kong, which helped finance trade and then eventually grow the global economy. A lot of the issues that was happening that we saw recently in the last year or so with people fighting back and the riots that were happening in Hong Kong had a lot to do with the fact that the British controlled Hong Kong for such a very, very long time. Then you have another corporation that's known as De Beers Diamonds. De Beers Diamonds is an example of a transnational corporation. So Cecil Rhodes, who is pictured there, he was an investor in the Trans-African Railroad. So Cecil Rhodes himself is eventually going to become the governor of Cape Colony. He's going to become governor of a South African colony. His goal actually was to connect all British colonies in Africa, which he felt would be very helpful, especially in time of war. However, that goal was never fully completed because Great Britain never controlled all of the land they needed to. When we get to the scramble for Africa, you're going to see that Africa was pretty much divided amongst a bunch of European countries, and there was only very, very small territories that actually belonged to the African people themselves. So they never controlled all the land they needed to make this dream of Cecil Rhodes actually happen. The railroads were built by African natives because it was cheaper labor, and then eventually the railroads were used to then take as many resources from Africa to Europe as possible. Obviously, the railroad doesn't connect to Europe, but they're what do you call it? They are transported to port cities, and then from port cities, you would then have the goods shipped via the ocean trade. So then you have an example of what is called a Unilever Corporation. This is kind of like a joint venture. You have the British and the Dutch who actually kind of combined, and it started out by them making soap in Australia, Switzerland, and the US. What they would do is they would take palm oil from the British West Africa and the Congo, and then they would eventually make other products. So I just want to show you on the next slide how big this company actually got. So if you look at this picture, and I probably need to move myself again, you can point out all of the companies that came from this one company. These are all different brands that I'm sure you guys have heard of. You have Breyers, you have Ben & Jerry's, you have the Magnum, all those are ice creams. You have Slim Fast, you have Bertolli, you have Hellmann's, which is like the mayonnaise, Lipton tea, the Q-tips, Vaseline, Degree, the deodorant, Dove soap, Axe, St. Ives, Lever, you have VO5, Tresemme. All of those businesses that you see originated from that one mother company. So it's kind of similar to like the monopoly type or style system where they would eventually venture out and then control the entire market. Okay, so the effects of industrialization on mass culture. You have consumerism. Consumerism is going to be when you have a rise in living standards, meaning the average person is able to buy more goods. So consumer means to consume. So people have more money to spend. People are buying more stuff. You also have the creation of the advertisement business. To keep up with competition, companies began to advertise their product to the middle class. Why the middle class? Well, the upper class buy stuff anyway. The lower class can't buy stuff because they're barely trying to survive. The middle class, however, has money to spend on non-essential items. So they can buy, for example, in the very, very top, you have an advertisement for Miss Winslow's soothing syrup. That's an advertisement for infants, or they don't sell it anymore, obviously, but it was for babies that were teething, and so they would put it on the baby's gums and it would help soothe them. If you were extremely wealthy, you already knew that, and you didn't need to have an advertisement to tell you to buy it. You would just buy it because you had the money to do it. If you were poor, you did not have the money to spend on something like that. You would probably, as sadly as it sounds, let your child, have to go through the teething process roughly as it goes. But the middle class did have money to spend, and so therefore they did, or they could, be influenced by these advertisements. You also have the rise of things like leisure activities. Leisure activities is actually pretty funny, or I think it's funny at least, because leisure means like your free time. People actually have free time now. They have time to do things other than working, other than surviving. So it's going to be an investment in terms of material goods, in terms of entertainment. So you're going to have the creation of bicycles. You're going to have movies or picture shows. You're going to have plays, theatrical shows, sporting events. People wanted to escape the reality that was their life. During the day, they worked extremely hard, laborious hours. And when they came home or when it was the weekend, they wanted to just relax and chill. You're also going to see the growth of sports. Companies are going to encourage participation in sports because they think that sports will help make people be more well-rounded, and it'll help people it'll help people play by the rules, and it'll create a sense of self-discipline in them. So you're going to see the rise of lots of sales equipment for sporting goods, and manufacturers are going to make a lot of money off of this. So for example, in Europe, you're going to have soccer becoming the number one sport over there. Over there, it's known as football, but here we call it soccer. Baseball in the United States are going to become the most popular pastime, or the most popular pastime for the American people. Football wouldn't come until later, our version of football. Then you have sports that also developed amongst social classes. So tennis and golf are going to be rich people sports because they are the ones that have the money to buy, the rackets, the golf clubs, the fancy things like that. And then rugby is going to be a poor man's sport because rugby is basically an early version of football. It's just man-to-man or hand-to-hand kind of combat fighting for a ball. So, and that's all you pretty much need. You're also going to see building events of spaces, public culture rising, so parks, event halls, big theatrical halls, opera houses. And this is going to be interesting because in these places you are actually going to start to see upper, middle, and lower classes be able to mingle with each other. Obviously, if you're going to a theater show, The pricier tickets are going to be for the upper class, but there's still going to be availability for middle and lower class people as well. So you'll see a little bit of social mixing happening at this time. Okay, 5.8, reactions to the industrial economy. So some background and explaining why people reacted the way they did. So the conditions at the time were extremely harsh, especially for people that worked in coal mines and factories. And these people wanted to fight for social reforms. They wanted change. They wanted the government to intervene. They wanted help. They wanted a voice for them because nobody was there to speak for them. So if you look at the political cartoon that's there, right there, it actually shows labor workers all kind of banding together, and they make one big giant fist. So the idea is that together as one group, as a unified group, they're a lot stronger. So some reform movements that we're going to see, one of them is the rise of labor unions. People knew that these reforms needed to happen because of dangerous, unsanitary working conditions, low wages, and long hours. So you're going to have the creation of unions. These unions are organizations of workers that advocated for the right to bargain with the employer. The reason that people needed unions was because if you fought with your employer, your boss, or not even fought, if you just voiced a concern or if you voiced your opinion, many times you were fired. Because there were so many other people that were ready to take your job that there was no job security. So people just kind of kept their mouths shut because they were afraid that if they spoke up, they were going to be jobless. And so they suffered these harsh conditions for such a long period of time because of fear of financial security. So these unions became important because it was a safe way for them to voice their concerns. And these are legitimate concerns that people obviously have. They wanted also right to be able to have contract work, which means that their jobs are secure. They can't be fired for just whatever reason. And the government at first saw these unions as enemies of trade because if you're disrupting the workforce or the workplace, that means that the factories aren't running like machines, people aren't making money, you're disrupting the money flow, you're going to upset some people. So it does become kind of a threat to the standing authority position at the time. The unions were asking for a couple of things. They wanted a minimum wage, so a set amount of money paid. They wanted to limit the amount of work hours because sometimes factories would make you work, that time that the whistle rang in the morning until the whistle rang in the evening. And that could be a 14-hour shift, that could be 6 days a week. It just depended on the factory. They also wanted overtime pay. So if you are going to work extra hours, you receive time and a half or you receive compensation, extra compensation for that work. And they wanted a 5-day work week. Because again, depending on your boss, depending on your employer, sometimes they might make you work 6 or even 7 days a week and you had no rest whatsoever. And that can be very dangerous because it leads to exhaustion. And then some people did even die from these overworking conditions. You also have voting rights becoming very, very popular during this time. Great Britain is going to expand voting access in several different phases, in 1832, in 1867, and in 1884. The first one is going to lower the amount of property white men needed to vote. So in Great Britain, you needed to own a certain percentage of property to be able to have a vote in Parliament. They're going to lower that amount so that it allows more people to vote. Then the second time that they change it or amend it, all men could vote in 1918 in Great Britain. And lastly, all women could vote by 1928. The United States would be first in this. Women would get the vote in 1919. And I always remember that because it's the 19th Amendment. So ironically, 1919, 19th Amendment. The last thing for reform movements is going to be child labor. Child labor is something that's going to haunt the industrialization period for a really long time. In 1843, you have laws that are passed that basically say that children under the age of 10 cannot work in coal mines. So the picture that you guys see there are children that look fairly young that have been working in coal mines. You're, 300, 400, 500 feet below the Earth's surface. You're digging, you're in darkness all day, you're breathing in coal dust. These people did not live very long lives. The life expectancy was extremely, extremely bad for them. They had respiratory conditions that would stay with them for the rest of their lives. They're very short lives. And then the mines would often collapse. And so it was very, very dangerous for these children. But children were employed because they could pay them less and they could pay the adults. So then in 1881, you're going to see education becoming mandatory for British children. that means that kids are going to be required to go to school. At that point, they weren't forced to go to school. It was only usually the rich families or maybe even the upper middle class families that would send their kids to school or had the means to send their kids to school. Whoops. Okay, so some more pictures. Just to kind of throw you for a culture shock, because in modern times, you can't really get a job until you're 16. In some very, very rare cases, you can get a hardship permit, but child labor was an extremely common practice during industrialization. You can even see some kids smoking right there. They're smoking cigarettes and cigars. The reason for that is because, and I know it sounds really ugly, but it helped keep them awake, and it also didn't remind them that they were hungry. And so factory owners would give them cigarettes or give them tobacco to keep them working continuously. You see the other picture there in the middle with the little kids barefoot and their little tiny hands. Some factory owners preferred to hire children because their hands were small enough to fit in the really small nooks and crannies of these machines. More pictures. Again, you can actually see a political cartoon of a guy who's supposed to be symbolic of a business owner, and children are literally pulling him on a cart. So obviously it's children are the ones who are carrying the burden of this workload. So it was a very dark time in history for all the countries. Okay, so intellectual reaction to all of these things. You're going to have two people that pop up that become really notable during this time. The first guy is John Stuart Mill. He's pictured there at the top. John Stuart Mill believed that laissez-faire capitalism was inhuman to laborers. The reason for that is because laissez-faire capitalism is a combination of the government doesn't have any control, and then capitalism means make the most profit. So the one who is making the most profit is the business owner. So he's obviously going to exploit the workers. He's going to make them work as hard as they can. He's not going to pay them as much, and he's going to not really care about their individual rights as people. So that is why he felt that it was inhuman to these laborers. He did want labor unions. He wanted to limit child labor, and he wanted more safe working conditions for his people. People basically refer to him as an utilitarian. Basically, it's considering the greatest good for the greatest number of people. He wanted reform to be moderate, rational, and gradual. So he realized that this was not going to happen overnight, that it was going to take a lot of government regulations to get these things done. Utopians, people who believed in a perfect society, completely wanted to replace capitalism altogether, while utilitarians wanted to fix the problems that had been created by society. Then you have Karl Marx, who's pictured there. Karl Marx is famous for eventually creating Marxism, which probably is going to evolve to socialism, which would then later evolve into an extreme form of communism. He was a German scholar who wanted and advocated for socialism, which is the idea that the laborers, the workers, are the ones that control the business. So he wrote this text called the Communist Manifesto along with another gentleman. He believed that capitalism was just another form of feudalism because you have the extreme rich and you have the extreme poor. He grouped people into two separate classes: the proletariat, which are the working class, the poor people, and then the bourgeoisie, who are the middle class and the upper class people. That's actually where you get the nickname bougie from, because it's a shortened version of this group of people. He believed that the bourgeoisie exploited the proletariat, very similar to John Stuart Mill. The rich people exploit the poor people for work. Under socialism, social classes would not exist. Everybody would be equal. The proletariat, like I said, would take control of business, and the wealth would be shared or divided equally. Sounds really good, guys, but when you try and actually put it into practice, it doesn't work very well. Okay, so Ottoman response to industrialization. I know it feels like we're going through a really long lesson. I'm going to try and hurry as much as I can. By the mid-1800s, the Ottomans were still very behind in terms of industrialization. In 1826, you have the Sultan Mahmud II, who finally made some reforms. So there's a picture of Mahmud. Mahmud abolished the Janissaries. Remember, Janissaries was that program that we talked about where they would take young Christian boys, usually from the Balkan territory, like Dracula territory, Transylvania, Romania, Bulgaria, and they would train them, they would convert them to Islam, and they'd become like these super crazy special forces type soldiers. Yeah, he did away with that. He actually created a new military that was trained by Europeans. He abolished the feudal system. The military officers or the Janissaries could no longer tax people. He built roads. He created a postal service. He secularized charities. So again, he removes power from the church and gives it to the government. And then he created government-style ministries. Ministries there does not mean Ministries like church. Ministries means like positions in the government. So think of Harry Potter like the Ministry of Defense. It's an organization or a group within a certain element of the empire. Okay, so you also have the Tanzimat reforms that come after Mahmud. These would help try and root out corruption. It would also secularize education. So again, we see that word pop up a lot during this time. You're going to have a big push and a big move away from religion because the church had such a dominant power in different places of the world. And this doesn't just apply to the Catholic Church. It's also the Islamic mosques. It's the Jewish faith. It's all different religions. They had such a long-standing control that you're going to see a lot of these monarchs, a lot of these rulers move away from that system. So education is no longer going to be controlled by the ulama or the Islamic leaders at the time. It's now going to belong to the state-sponsored education system. They also codified the Ottoman laws, which are going to be put in what is going to, I hope I don't mispronounce it, but it's called the Hati Humayun, which is like an official document, kind of similar to a constitutional binding document because it updates the legal system, but it also creates equality for all men in education, in government appointments, and justice regardless of ethnicity or religion, because you have to remember that the Ottoman Empire again was made up of Christian, Jews, Muslims, and then a whole bunch of other ethnicities as well. The results are going to be that the Ottoman Empire does eventually thrive, but very, very, very slowly. So the economy is finally going to become cash-based instead of relying on gold or silver. Banking is going to increase. Industrialization, like I said, spreads slowly, but really and truly this only helped men. The women in the Ottoman Empire are actually going to suffer because under Islamic law, under Sharia law, women are guaranteed certain rights or certain protections and certain freedoms under that specific old way of doing things. Under this new way of doing things, they are not. So it actually does or is a step backward for them. Then in the 1870s, you're going to see many other sultans very afraid to take on these new types of reform systems. You have the Sultan Abdul Hamid, who's going to exile the Young Turks. The Young Turks were a group that wanted to reform and change the Ottoman Empire. He's going to anger minority groups. It's going to lead to the massacre of about 100,000 to 250,000 Armenian Christians. It becomes known as the Armenian Genocide. They're still going to deny, or some people will still deny that this even occurred, but it was them blaming these, it was a minority group within the Ottoman Empire, and they're going to blame them for being spies, and they're going to blame them for doing things that they didn't do, and it was an excuse to wipe them out. It was genocide. It was a horrible, horrible situation. Okay. So some reforms in China. You do have the self-strengthening movement. It's going to be China's reaction in the late 19th century to the pressure to modernize. This is going to happen during the Qing dynasty. It's going to strengthen China by advancing military technology, manufacturing arms, which is weapons, and ships. They will eventually set up a diplomatic corps to be able to interact with other nations, and they're going to have a customs agency to help collect taxes on imports and exports. You're going to have a lot of instances of rebellion happening in China. So you have the 100 Days Reform. After China's last war to Japan, because remember, Japan had imperialistic ambitions. They wanted to go and encroach and invade other territories. You have one reformer known as Kang Yue, who met with the Emperor Guangxu and called for the abolition of the civil service exam, the elimination of corruption within the system. He wanted an establishment of Western-style industrialization, commercialism, and medical systems. The response to that was that the Dowager Empress, Dowager is the name that's given to somebody when their husband passes away, so she was like a widow. Yue's aunt, the Empress Cixi, did not want reforms, and she actually led a coup and was successful and overthrew him and replaced him. She was very hesitant to accept any kind of foreign aid, any kind of foreign influence. She restricted technology like the railroad and the telegraph. She did, however, realize that the civil service exam was corrupt, and she eventually got rid of that. So there's the Empress Cixi up there. It is going to cause problems. So Cixi is not going to be very, very popular. You're going to have traditional Chinese people who are going to back her 100%, but those who wanted reform are going to go against her. So Europe wanted China to change. They wanted to help China modernize, even despite the Boxer Rebellion. So their Boxer Rebellion was a revolt led by the Chinese people against any foreigners in Japan. The reason for that, in China. I got confused for a second. In China, because they wanted them out of the country. And so the rebellion is actually going to be a complete failure. It was nicknamed the Boxer Rebellion because it was a way to actually insult the Chinese people who were supposed to be expert martial artists or good at fighting and calisthenics and things like that. So it was actually a term meant to demean them or put them down. But China is eventually going to become so weak that they will actually have to accept aid from Western powers. They're going to have to open up their borders and open up their ports and say, okay, kind of come in and take what you need. We just need help. We just need money. Eventually, in 1911, the Qing dynasty is going to be overthrown and China will just become a republic. It was the United States that actually helped China resist encroachment from surrounding areas. So China was extremely slow to industrialize. Okay, so some limits and resistance to reform. Diet Coke break. My throat gets dry. Okay. In Japan, in 1871, they will abolish the samurai, so that practice becomes eliminated. Some served in the government still as what were known as generals, which is like a high position of power, but many of them resisted change. They wanted to stay autonomous from the central government, so they wanted the same rights that they had always had in the empire. And they tried to fight with the government, but obviously they lost the government after the Mej Restoration was extremely powerful. Under the Ottoman Empire, they tried to industrialize, but you had a lot of nervous leaders who did not support reform, and it was going to actually hurt the empire. China would industrialize later, but again, conservative leaders are going to take a lot longer, and it will become liberal, but it is going to take a while. The long-lasting results are going to be that obviously some reforms are more successful than others. Overall, education reforms improve the literacy of the people. The more people read, the more they know. Economically, industrialization spread rapidly, and you're going to have the rise of a lot of democratic traits, things like free press, things like labor unions, and things like individual liberties. Okay, last one, or last topic. 5.9, the effects of the industrial age of society. So, industrialization changed the way people lived. The middle class grew more comfortable, the poor worked and lived awful conditions, children labored in factories, poor women spent less time at home, middle class women felt stifled at home, and people began seeking more entertainment and leisure activities. I'll go through these kind of fast because we've already kind of touched on them on a lot of the slides. So in the urban areas, for the first half of the 19th century, urban areas, which is city areas, grew very quickly with little planning by the government, which means because they were growing so fast, they didn't have time to plan for things like apartment buildings or fire escapes, or to even make sure that these buildings were safe or up to code or anything like that. And so oftentimes these buildings were so horrible, they were called tenements. They were very, very poorly run. Families were crammed together in these little tiny hovel apartments. They were located in probably the worst areas or neighborhoods. The water was polluted. They were located near open sewers, and that leads to a spread of disease, and it also leads to easy access to fire, crime, and violence, which was very, very common in these bad areas. It's going to encourage the creation of fire departments and police departments to actually help keep the peace, because there's going to be so many people living in one area that it's a dangerous, it's an accident waiting to happen. It's also going to help encourage public health reform to create better sewage and sanitation systems, ways to remove trash, and ways to bring clean water into these areas that there was no planning for at the time. Class structure is going to change somewhat. So industrialists and factory owners obviously are at the top. That's your business owners. You have white collar workers. Those are known as your office managers. They did have some skill. So they're called white collar because they get to wear the suits and their white shirts don't get dirty. The growing middle class experiences higher standards of living, and this is what kept people moving to the cities. This is kind of like, and I don't want to throw it out there, but I kind of do, it's kind of like chasing the American dream, if you will. The factory workers were the lowest group of people. Their working class are called blue collars because they have to wear the blue work shirts because they're going to get dirty. And their wages stayed extremely low because they didn't have to have a specialized skill. And there was so many people that were needing jobs at the time that they were easily replaceable. Some changes to industrial life. So farms versus factories. Life before the industrialization period was largely agricultural, which means people worked on farms. Families used to spend all their days near each other, And then with industrialization, people actually had to leave their homes and their neighborhoods, and they had to get used to working on a certain schedule. So whenever that bell rang, until that bell ended, like I said, exhaustion was very common, injury and death were very, very common because of the long hours and because of the harsh conditions. The effects on children, families needed more money, so children also went to work, and the working conditions were so poor, and many, many, many children died. If you look at the numbers, and I'm going to go through it really, really quickly, the number of children working in factories under age 11 is 246 for males and then 155 for females. Children between the ages of 11 and 16 jumps almost, I'm really bad at math, you know this, but like, I don't know what, 7 times, maybe 5 times, up into the thousands range. So that is a very low or young amount of children working in these factories that are not going to school, that are not receiving an education, that are the breadwinners for their families. The effects on women's lives. So different classes of women were affected differently. Lower class women went to work in factories. Most of them worked in coal mines and textile factories. They were paid half of what men were paid. And we still see that gender wage gap even happening to this day. It's not as bad as that is, but you do see a wage gap that still occurs, and you guys learned that in 9th grade. Middle class women, it's a status symbol for them not to work, because if they marry well or if they have wealthy husbands, they can stay at home. So it becomes a status symbol. It becomes like look at me, like I get to be a housewife. But eventually it leads to boredom because they had nothing to do. You have the creation of what becomes known as the cult of domesticity. So domesticity again means home. Advertisers during this time glorified the housewife, the perfect wife. The children are perfect, the house is always clean, and it was extremely difficult for working class women because working class women had to work 14 hours a day in these factories and then go home and be perfect mothers as well. So you're going to see a lot of advertisements. These women have their hair done, they have their makeup done, you know, they're ironing in pearls or they're vacuuming in heels and they're reading to their kids and everything looks perfect. It was just a facade. It was something that was sold to these women to make them happy. But it really wasn't that happiness. They had very bleak, boring lives. Some more changes to industrial life. Are the effects on the environment. So dependency on fossil fuels like coal, petroleum, and natural gas negatively impacted the environment. Factories produced lots of toxic air pollution, smoke, smog, water pollution, and they spread disease. We know that even to this day. And the legacy of the Industrial Revolution is that mass production made goods cheaper, more abundant, and it gave people more access to them. So people can make stuff faster. People are going to move to the city, so there's a lot more urbanization, but also more crowding leads to more crime. You have environmental degradation, so slowly our environment starts to get worse and worse and worse because of all the pollution that we're emitting into the atmosphere. Workplace is going to shift from the homes to the factories, which changed family life forever. And then you're going to continue to have global inequalities increasing because what you're going to see is a lot of these industrialized states are going to take over non-industrialized nations, which is going to give rise to imperialism. The quest for more resources, the quest for more, and to colonize these poor countries that don't have the capabilities that other industrialized nations have. All right, lastly. Okay, so tomorrow on Thursday, jumping ahead. Thursday, April 30th, you guys actually have your simulated DBQ that's going to be up there. I'll give you a hint. It's on mercantilism. I'm not going to tell you what, but it's on mercantilism, which helps with all the Unit 5 information. It will be available on Thursday at 1 p.m. And the rationale for that, guys, is because when you take the actual AP exam, it's going to be on a Thursday at 1 p.m. So we wanted to get you into the habit of logging in at that time consistently so that you're remembering that that's when your AP exam is actually going to be. Just a final reminder that the AP survey was due. You needed to have submitted the information so that we know who's taking how many AP exams. And then a bonus, there's no video on Friday. So this is the last video for the week. Hope you guys have a great weekend. I will see you guys Monday. But if you have any other questions until then, please feel free to call me or email me. Bye-bye. See you later.